They poured fish into the desert. They buried bundles of straw into the burning sand. Not as spectacle, not as folly, but as defiance against a land the world had long abandoned. This was not America. This was not China. This was Burkina Faso, small, landlocked, scarred by drought, where a young president named Ibrahim Traoré dared to confront the impossible. For years, the Sahel crept forward like a silent army. Villages disappeared, not from war but from sand. Wells dried, cattle fell, families scattered. 1/3 of the nation's soil teetered on the edge of ruin. It was not a disaster, it was an emergency. And speeches alone could not hold back the desert. So straw was laid in checkerboards, slowing the wind, trapping the moisture. Ponds were dug, holding water drawn from hidden veins beneath the sand. Into them went tilapia, fish where no fish should swim. Absurd to some, miraculous to others. But slowly, undeniably, life stirred. The question now is simple yet seismic. If straw and fish can turn back the Sahel, what else might we have underestimated? Do not turn away. This is more than a headline. Subscribe, stay with us, and witness a nation daring to rewrite its fate. It began not with thunder, but with a whisper, the whisper of sand carried by relentless winds. Each year the Sahel advanced, swallowing fields and villages with silent cruelty. In northern Burkina Faso, families woke to find their farmland buried. Entire communities vanished from the map, not by conflict but by grains of dust. Wells ran dry, cattle collapsed, and hope itself seemed to rot beneath the same sun that rose each morning. This was no passing drought. It was a national emergency. 1/3 of Burkina Faso's territory was on the brink of becoming uninhabitable. And in a country where most people still depend on the soil, the crisis was existential. If the land died, so too would the nation. President Ibrahim Traoré knew speeches could not stop the desert. Words do not pin down sand, and promises do not make water flow. What was required was action, radical, immediate, and rooted in the resources at hand. And so, under his direction, communities across the Sahelian provinces were called to mobilize. Their weapon? Straw. Yes, dried stalks discarded after harvest, the very substance most would burn or cast aside. Men, women, even school children worked side by side, bundling straw into squares and laying them across dunes in vast checkerboard patterns. To an outsider, it looked absurd, like some giant board game played upon a dying earth. Yet the logic was sound. The straw slowed the wind. It anchored the sand. It trapped pockets of precious moisture. Over time, it began to decompose, seeding nutrients into the barren soil. These squares became shields, miniature fortresses in which life could take root. Within each straw square, a tree was planted. Not just any tree, but species hardened by centuries of survival, acacia, moringa, the stubborn children of the Sahel. Farmers began to notice change. In the straw grids, the air felt cooler. The wind no longer stung the skin. Saplings that once wilted within days now stood upright for weeks. For the first time in years, the desert was not winning. But straw alone was not enough. Water, the rarest treasure of the Sahel, had to be found. Beneath the scorched crust lay hidden aquifers and seasonal underground flows. Engineers and hydrologists, guided by local knowledge, tapped into this lifeblood. Man-made ponds began to appear, shimmering like mirrors dropped into the desert. These ponds were not simply water holes for survival. They were the stage for something audacious, fish farms. Skeptics scoffed. Fish in the Sahel? In a land where even trees fought for breath? But Traoré had a vision. If water could be harnessed, then life, food, income, even microclimates, could be created. Tilapia, hardy and resilient, were introduced. Solar-powered sensors monitored oxygen and temperature. Automated feeders kept the fish alive and growing. Local youth, once aimless and unemployed, were trained in aquaculture, becoming fish farmers with both pride and purpose. The first harvests were small, but they carried immense weight. These were not just fish, they were proof. Proof that regeneration was possible. Proof that a land dismissed as hopeless could still sustain its people. In villages that had emptied, families began to return. Children who once fled to cities, or worse, to armed groups, now stood beside their parents tending ponds and planting trees. Markets, once starved of produce, began to sell Sahel-grown fish. The impossible had become reality. From straw grids to fish ponds, from dry dunes to sapling groves, a new ecosystem was being woven. Not by machines or foreign consultants, but by the calloused hands of villagers who refused to surrender. And yet this was only the beginning. The desert is patient. It advances not in days, but in decades. The question lingered over every bundle of straw, every pond dug, every fish harvested. Could this fragile line of defense truly hold back the Sahel's march? Or was it merely a pause before the sands returned stronger than ever? The answer would be tested not only by the land, but by the people, and the world was starting to watch. The moment of climax did not arrive in a palace or a summit hall. It came in the dust of Wahiguya, where elders, children, and soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with their president. On national television, Ibrahim Traoré bent to the earth, scooped up a handful of soil once condemned to drift, and raised it aloft. This, he declared, is what victory feels like, not in parades or treaties, but in the earth itself. The crowd roared. Elders wept openly, tears cutting paths through the dust on their faces. Children waved flags woven from recycled straw, symbols of resistance more powerful than any banner of war. It was a moment both intimate and historic, a convergence of grief, relief, and hope bound together in the palm of one man's hand. Across the provinces, the reaction was electric. Farmers who had once abandoned their fields now returned, bending backs not in resignation but in pride. Women's cooperatives sprang to life, organizing nurseries for saplings and producing fish feed. Young men, so often depicted as either migrants or militants, found themselves transformed into aquaculturists and tree planters. For the first time in years, rural families believed their children might inherit something other than dust. Markets echoed with new sounds. The splash of fresh fish in baskets, the bargaining voices of traders, the laughter of children chasing each other between stalls. What had been unimaginable months before, Sahel-grown tilapia, saplings rooted in dune-stricken soil, was now routine. The absurd had become ordinary. The psychological shift was profound. For decades, villages in the north had felt abandoned by the state, by the world, even by hope itself. Now, for the first time, they saw results. Soldiers who once patrolled with rifles now planted trees alongside villagers. Teachers returned to schools that had reopened near restored ponds. Communities once paralyzed by mistrust began working side by side, laying straw squares and tending fish ponds. Out of labor came dignity, out of dignity, peace. Social media carried the story further still. Young people filmed themselves laying straw grids, checking pond levels, or holding up saplings like trophies. Clips of teenagers proudly showing fish tanks in desert villages went viral, reshaping how the outside world saw Burkina Faso. The narrative shifted, from one of despair and extremism to one of innovation and resilience. International journalists arrived, their notebooks and cameras filled with contradictions, checkerboards of straw holding back dunes, children releasing tilapia into desert ponds, families celebrating under trees that should not exist. Reports circulated with words that sounded like parables: miracle, rebirth, defiance. The Guardian, Al Jazeera and National Geographic each ran features that framed Burkina Faso not as a victim of climate, but as a pioneer of renewal. Environmentalists praised the project as a miracle in the making. Foreign policy analysts, more cautious, called it a bold assertion of sovereignty. But all agreed. Something was stirring in the Sahel. The emotional peak lay not just in the images, but in the feeling that swept through the nation. National pride surged. In homes across Burkina Faso, radios replayed the president's words, and families spoke with a new sense of belonging. Where there had been silence, there was now music. Where there had been despair, there was now laughter. For the first time in a generation, the people of Burkina Faso saw themselves not merely as victims of climate change, but as its first responders. This shift in identity carried immense weight. To act was to reclaim dignity. To work was to rewrite destiny. To plant a tree, to tend a pond, to lay a straw square beneath a brutal sun, these acts became more than labor. They became a declaration: we are still here. We will not surrender. And yet, as momentum built within the nation, eyes abroad turned with growing intensity. Delegations from Niger and Mali walked the restored dunes, touched the leaves of young acacia trees, and sampled fish pulled from ponds carved into desert sands. They said little, but the silence itself was telling. This was not just Burkina Faso's story anymore. It was a challenge to every nation in the Sahel still losing ground to the desert. The world was no longer asking whether Burkina Faso had survived. It was asking how far this vision could reach. The first consequence was seen not in policy papers, but in the footsteps of those who returned. For years, migration had been a one-way road. Young men fleeing south in search of city jobs or north into the perilous grasp of militias. The desert had emptied the villages as surely as war empties battlefields. Yet now families began to come back. Where straw grids held the sand, homes were rebuilt. Where ponds shimmered, markets revived. Migration patterns shifted, and with them, the very rhythm of rural life. Children who once trekked miles for water now attended schools reopened beside restored wells. Mothers who had feared watching their sons vanish into the unknown now saw them working in aquaculture, earning an income without leaving their community. Fathers, once broken by barren fields, stood tall again, guiding oxen across land that was greening by the season. The social fabric, long torn by scarcity and mistrust, began to mend. Women's cooperatives took root, managing tree nurseries, processing fish feed, and distributing saplings. Their role was not token, it was central. The very act of organizing gave women new authority within their communities, reshaping dynamics that had long kept them on the margins. They were no longer waiting for solutions. They were building them. Young people, too, found purpose where none had existed. Equipped with solar pumps, straw-laying manuals, and smartphones linked to monitoring apps, they formed a new kind of core: farmers, scientists, guardians of the land. Videos of their work circulated widely, proof that rural youth could be more than migrants or fighters. They could be innovators, custodians of resilience. But the most profound consequence was political. For decades, Burkina Faso's countryside had distrusted Ouagadougou. Central government felt distant, more a symbol of imposition than of service. Traoré's initiative altered that perception. Instead of police patrols, villages now welcomed officials carrying seeds, tools, and training. Instead of rhetoric, there were results. The state gained something it had rarely possessed outside its cities: legitimacy. This legitimacy mattered in a nation with a history of coups and upheavals. Traoré's administration found itself strengthened not through repression, but through renewal. Opposition voices struggled to find fault. What could be criticized? Trees that grew too quickly? Fish that swam too vigorously? Even rivals began to echo the language of resilience, climate justice, and renewal. The project blurred partisan lines, uniting communities under a banner not of ideology, but of survival. Security, too, felt the impact. In areas once plagued by attacks, violence diminished. Not because of more troops, but because villagers had something tangible to defend. Ponds, saplings, the fragile infrastructure of hope. Where desperation had once fed extremism, dignity now offered resistance. Peace, it turned out, could grow from the soil as surely as millet or moringa. The symbolism deepened as murals appeared in village centers, depicting children holding fish in one hand and straw bundles in the other. Radio stations ran weekly updates on the Green Line, the expanding frontier where land was restored. Even the nation's soldiers, once symbols of instability, became symbols of renewal, photographed planting trees and laying straw beside civilians. Above all, what emerged was a new sense of agency. For decades, many Burkina citizens had felt at the mercy of outsiders, donors, NGOs, former colonial powers. Now they felt ownership. The desert was still there, but it no longer dictated destiny. The people themselves did. Dignity was no longer a word in speeches. It was a daily practice, embodied in sweat and soil. It was in this transformation that observers began to speak of a new model of African leadership, not measured by the grandeur of summits or the flow of foreign aid, but by the stubborn courage to face down the desert with nothing but hands, straw, and belief. Leadership rooted not in promises but in proof. And yet, even as communities stabilized and politics found new legitimacy, the story could not remain confined within Burkina Faso's borders. The success of straw and fish was drawing attention from beyond the Sahel. The question was no longer whether the project worked, but whether the world was ready to follow its lead. At first, the world treated Burkina Faso's experiment as a curiosity. Reports of straw checkerboards and fish ponds in the desert sounded more like parables than policy. Yet as images spread, saplings rising where dunes once stood, tilapia harvested miles from cracked earth, perceptions began to shift. International journalists arrived, their headlines turning astonishment into admiration. National Geographic published a feature titled "Straw Against the Sand." Al Jazeera and The Guardian ran stories portraying not just resilience but reinvention. Environmentalists described the initiative as a miracle in the making. Analysts in foreign policy circles framed it differently, as sovereignty in action, a small state refusing dependency, rewriting its story through ingenuity. Institutions responded too. The United Nations Environment Program issued a preliminary report praising the initiative as a locally driven, low-tech model with high-impact potential. African agricultural think tanks began studying its replication in other dry lands, recognizing in straw and fish a blueprint adaptable across the continent. Neighboring nations could not ignore the transformation. Delegations from Niger, Mali, and Chad traveled quietly to Burkina Faso, walking through the straw grids, tasting Sahel-grown fish, and studying the ponds. Their silence carried weight. This was no longer just a Burkina experiment, it was a regional challenge. If one country could resist the desert with its bare hands, what excuse did others have? The seeds of a Sahel alliance against desertification were being sown, not in conference rooms but in sand-swept villages. In the United States, the story resonated for different reasons. American universities such as UC Davis and Texas A&M, long known for agricultural research, reached out for partnerships. The Peace Corps proposed integrating the straw method into reforestation programs. USAID quietly began funding pilot projects inspired by Burkina Faso in Mali, Chad, and southern Niger. Analysts in Washington flagged the initiative as a model worth watching. proof that resilience did not always require billion-dollar interventions. The irony was sharp. At a time when global powers poured vast sums into grand climate projects, a small West African nation had reshaped its ecological destiny with straw, sunlight, and labor. The world, accustomed to thinking in terms of scale and money, now faced an unsettling question. What if simplicity could succeed where complexity had failed? And so attention turned from admiration to expectation. Could this fragile victory in Burkina Faso ignite a wider transformation across the Sahel and beyond? The Sahel has never been a land of guarantees. Its sun is relentless, its winds unyielding. For all the gains made, the risks remain stark. What if the ponds dry under harsher droughts? What if disease sweeps through fragile stocks of fish? What if storms tear apart straw grids painstakingly laid beneath the sun? Skeptics are not wrong to raise these questions. Yet for every doubt, Burkina Faso has crafted an answer. Rotational cycles rest the ponds between harvests, reducing strain on the aquifers. Multiple tree species are interwoven into the grids, cutting the risk of monoculture collapse. Drones and satellites now survey temperature shifts and vegetation cover, providing data where once there was only guesswork. The system, while humble, continues to evolve, adaptation layered upon adaptation. At the national level, Traoré's government has begun institutionalizing this spirit. The Ministry of Youth and Employment launched a national Green Corps. Thousands of young people trained in agroecology and aquaculture, each equipped with solar pumps, smartphones, and straw-laying manuals. These recruits form not only a workforce but a symbol, a generation defending their soil with knowledge as much as with sweat. The potential stretches beyond Burkina Faso. If villages across the Sahel replicate this model, an arc of restored land could slow the desert's march, stabilize communities, and weaken the hand of extremists who prey upon despair. What began as survival could grow into strategy, knitting together nations in a belt of resilience. But challenges will persist. Funding is fragile, climate change accelerates, and global attention can be fickle. Will the world recognize the value of low-tech, locally driven resilience? Or will it dismiss straw and fish as too modest, too small, while billions are funneled into projects that never reach the soil? Still, amid uncertainty, one truth shines. The people of Burkina Faso have proven that dignity can be planted, watered, and harvested. What remains is scale, persistence, and the courage to keep laying straw even when the wind howls louder than before. And so the story stands at a threshold. Will the Sahel bloom wider, or will the sands reclaim their ground? The answer lies not only in the desert, but in the choices we make now. From the simplest of materials, straw scattered across dunes, fish swimming in improbable ponds, an entire people have drawn dignity from the dust. What began as an act of desperation has matured into a philosophy of survival, a living testament that sovereignty is not granted but built, handful by handful, square by square. Burkina Faso's story is not merely agricultural. It is moral. It reminds us that power does not always come with wealth or weapons. Sometimes it comes with patience, with labor, with the courage to sow seeds where others see only sand. In doing so, Ibrahim Traoré has embodied a form of African leadership rarely acknowledged on the global stage. Leadership that does not wait for salvation but creates it. The resonance extends beyond one nation. As Niger, Mali, and Chad explore similar paths, the possibility of a Sahel alliance emerges, not a bloc defined by treaties or slogans, but by shared survival, by hands working the soil together. If the Sahel can bloom, then perhaps the world must reconsider what it means to resist climate collapse. And what of us watching from afar? The lesson is both humbling and urgent. If one of the poorest countries on Earth can reshape its climate future with straw and fish, what excuse remains for those with riches, technologies, and endless debate? If a village can reverse despair with little more than sunlight and will, what might entire nations achieve if they chose dignity over delay? This is not charity. This is not pity. This is sovereignty. It is also a call to recognize in Burkina Faso not just a struggle but a blueprint. A call to honor the soil, to defend the hands that till it, to believe that deserts can be turned into fields of hope. So we leave you with a question. If straw and fish can change the fate of a nation, what small act of courage might you too commit to the future? Do not let this story fade. Share it, speak of it, and stand with those who have chosen to fight for the land. Subscribe, not out of habit, but out of conviction, that truth, resilience, and African leadership deserve a voice louder than the wind.